Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode on the World Crypto Network. And today we are going to be talking about one of our favorite topics, which is identity systems online. Now, we brought this up several times in the past, and we talked about these issues before about systems like Google and Facebook mandating that you give your real names, and now that we've got something like a distributed ledger on the internet with the form of the blockchain, that becomes a whole lot more serious. So a couple of weeks ago, we had Paul Snow from Factom to discuss his immutable database entries in the blockchain, and we were coming to you from Canary Wharf, the center of the finance here in London, UK. But today, I'm actually joined by quite a few number of very well-known guests, so I'm going to ask them all to identify themselves. I'm joined first by the globally recognized anarchist, Brian Sovereign. Brian, say hello.
Hello, thanks for having me on again.
And someone who's also very famous and well-recognized, and probably one of the best critics of this whole topic, is Paige Peterson.
Hey, thanks for having me back. I'm excited to have this discussion.
And we're also joined today by Greg Spelek from OK Turtles. Identify yourself, Greg.
Hey, yeah, Greg Slepek, and thanks for having me on.
Thank you. And we're also joined by the omnipresent David Irvine. How are you doing?
Hi, nice to see you again, and thanks for having me here.
Thanks for joining us. Well, let's start with you, David, because the reason I invited you on for this little cameo appearance, you're not going to be joining us for the whole show today, is because at the end of our last show, when we were having such a raging discussion about the identity system, you brought up this interesting point in the comments below, where you were saying that you didn't see an actual role for identity systems in the future at all. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you meant by that?
Yeah, I think identity systems, to me, they're a bit like money. I don't think there's going to be a requirement for either of those in the future. At the moment, we might be able to evolve where we can actually all have identities, but at the moment, it's just something to be taken off you by governments or something, and then you're controlled by it. So this, people that are wanting to stamp an identity on everything, it kind of to me is a bit like the headline society. It's like think harder what you're doing, You go giving guns to people to try and protect them, then they start shooting you. We do these things all the time. So an identity is only valid when it's very, very local. So you can address people in your own village or whatever. But when people outside your village start using these identities and attaching tax bills onto them or figuring out ways to control basically people, then it becomes an issue, because at the moment I think we're controlled by people who don't know us. But they know us through these identities, and the identity is always going to do that while we've got this avarice for greed at the moment in society. The rich people trying to get richer, it's quite easy to get rich. They used to send us off to war to shoot each other. Now, there's a different kind of war. It's not the war on terror, it's the kind of war on finance that's going on.
Well, so you're tying this to an economic thing, but I want to just focus on the initial point that you brought up.
I think it's very linked at the moment, because we're ruled by a crazy, insane economic system at the moment, and we're able to be because of identity. If these identities weren't tied in, then the ability to control people that you can't address is removed. As soon as you can address and file these things away, then you can control people. So there's no reason to know that. I don't need to know the identity of someone who writes a scientific paper. I just need to know their maths is right. What's the point of knowing their name? Who cares who said E equals MC squared, or all of these things? It's not important. And we need to spin this on its head. What would the world be like without identities? What if it was only information, and that information was taken and proven to be correct or proven to be incorrect, and then you just build up the information in the world? I'm quite sure in 5,000 years it won't matter that David Irvine said whatever he said. The information that he said may be valuable. If it is, it will remain in society. If it's not, it should die away. The name.
It doesn't sound to me like you're denying that we need a way of referring to one another. So you, for example, have a name and you put your name down into the lower third on your screen, and it helps us to have a dialogue, because if we didn't have a stable referent by which we could call one another, then we probably wouldn't get very far in life. But are you saying that as a witness to this conversation that I'm not allowed to write your name down in like an address book? And
you can do whatever you want. I just think it's irrelevant.
Right.
It's irrelevant. I've either told you something valuable which you'll tell other people, or I've told you something invaluable which you'll find boring and not repeat. And I think this is nature's, I've written about it before, it's nature's greatest invention. When you get older and you're not putting in information to society, and you're not providing value to society, what happens? You get killed. You know, you're killed off. You're only valuable to the human species when you're putting information in. Your name is irrelevant to the information. I mean, 1 and 1 equals 2. Whoever came up with that astounding thing, which isn't true actually, whoever came up with that, does it matter? Does it matter who invented the chassis? You know, does it matter who invented the toilet? Or who built the space rocket to go to the moon? What difference does it make? Like the guy who fixed polio, you know, did a great job, and he gave it away for nothing. You know, it doesn't matter. He's called Jonas Salk, but it's irrelevant to somebody who could have got polio.
Except sometimes when it comes to reputation, we do require some prior knowledge of somebody. Like if I'm going to give you a loan, it would help if I knew that you wrote scientific papers.
No, I don't agree. I think it's all, again, we're just compartmentalizing things. We're doing the identifying the blue jay because that's what it looks like. Your reputation's valid for the very second that you receive it. A second later, you could be mown down by a bus. You could meet some person in your life that makes you take different choices from you previously would have. You could become a jihadist. The reputation systems are like everything else. They're okay when you look back and say, oh, from the beginning of this person's life till now, he's been X or Y. And what will he be tomorrow? And if you knew what somebody was going to be tomorrow based on what they were yesterday, you would be an absolute, totally rich person because you'd be able to tell what companies were going to do.
Well, your perception of time would be completely distorted too, because if you're saying tomorrow is like yesterday, then really you're saying it's not a new day, it's the same over and over again.
The stock market, you wouldn't need to guess what was going to happen. If reputation was actually solid, you would know what's going to happen. You would be able to take a snapshot of society, calculate everybody's reputation and ability to innovate or whatever, tie it down, and know what's going to happen the next second to the next. And if we can't do that, reputation's invalid. It's only good as a historical measure of how criminal were you, how good at maths were you, how good at art were you, until this point where you measure it. It's a bit like quantum physics. As soon as you start measuring it, it's invalid.
Well, no, except history does rhyme, doesn't it? There are some features of the past that do keep happening, and I guess it's one's ability to build accurate patterns in the world that can often lead to a longer survival.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter. I mean, if somebody else came along just now, and a wee short German guy with a thingy moustache, you wouldn't all of a sudden shoot him, thinking, "Good God," you know, or if his name was Adolf Hitler, even you wouldn't shoot him.
You say that, but not very many kids were called Adolf after Adolf Hitler, were they? I mean, there was something of a stigma around his name.
There was, but there's a lot of boys called Jesus. You know, so the name is irrelevant. The reputation till that point is irrelevant. Regarding history, what's important about history is the facts of what happened, not who did what.
Okay, so let's bring this into the present, because I also want to get Paige's perspective on this as well, because I know that you two are in agreement on this. So in today's world, when I go on the internet, and it's a very Western internet, it's a very Silicon Valley driven internet, I don't get any of Africa, I don't get any of China, I basically get American style corporations that want me to sign up for something. They want me to sign up for a newsletter. They want some ability to tether who I am to my action in that moment so that they can call me back. So they've got me in a sales funnel. That's one of the things they want to get me into. They also take your IP address. We talked about it on air before, but there's a great app called the Ghostery app, which tells you all the scripts that run in the browser whenever you go to a web page. And it will tell you the names of all these marketing companies that have JavaScript running in the frame. And then what they will do is they'll take your IP address, they'll put a cookie on your computer, and whenever you go to one of their affiliates, any one of their partner websites again, they will make note of the fact that you've also visited these types of of things, and then they will consolidate that. So I don't think many people are going to disagree, unless they work in marketing, that this is probably a bad idea. This is entirely unnecessary, and it's being performed, they will claim, because I've spoken to marketers before, they will claim it's because consumers won't pay. That when it comes to the point of purchase, that they'll often bounce, or they won't make the purchase, and the cost of hosting the website on the server just isn't there, so they have to market the data. That's the only way they can make the business model work.
I think we might have lost Paige.
Yeah, we did actually, we did. But do you want to come in on this, Greg?
Yeah, sure. The assertion is that identity and names don't matter. It's sort of irrelevant to the information. It doesn't really matter who made the chassis. In some sense, I understand. I understand where David is coming from, but it's not it's not true in all cases. We certainly do put identities do matter to us. I wouldn't be on this show if you didn't know who I was, and you only know who I am based on my previous work. None of us would be here on the show if that wasn't the case. Our audience would have no reason to listen to us because they just, would be random strangers to them. Identity is extremely important, and it's even more so important whenever security is involved, because security, especially whenever you're communicating across the internet or across some sort of communication channel, you have to have some kind of notion of trust. That you can trust somebody, and if you don't have, and trust is based on identity. So identity plays a significantly important role in security, and it can even play a very big role in terms of economics, finances, etc. That's a whole tangential topic that we can go on to. We can stick to security for now, but for example. Just to let you know where my headspace is right now. In terms of money, identity is extremely important to any concept that involves a universal basic income or this concept of free money. Identity is essential. You can't have it, universal basic income, without identity, a strong concept of identity. So there's that.
So Brian, I want, because we've lost Paige, before she comes back, I know that you guys are broadly in agreement with this side. Did you have anything to add to David's comments or any kind of rebuttals to Greg before we move on?
Yeah. Well, 2 points. One is that actually Ghostery, which you mentioned, they actually, while they will tell you, what third-party, cookies or whatever info of affiliate links and whatever that you're going through, they actually sell off your information to marketers. So Ghostery is not like, pure and clean in the whole matter. But aside from that, I think there's a huge difference between, like what Greg's talking about, there's a difference between like an access control request and identity. I don't think to have $1,000, for you to have $1,000 requires an ID. It requires access control, like your wallet, be it your physical or your digital, but it doesn't necessarily require you to know that I'm Brian Sovereign and I have 1,000 bitcoins or whatever. It can be stupid. It doesn't have to have all of that information. And I think it's important to delineate: are we talking about identity as in me, Brian Sovereign, or identity as in an access control request for perhaps digital goods or whatever that I own, or even like property or whatever that happens to be? I think those are two different things that we got to be clear on what we're talking about. So, because access control requests, I'm not against that. In some ways you have to have that, but as far as what's required to get that control, what's required to meet the needs of that request, I think doesn't require much. An example I bring up often on my own show is a safe, like a literal, fireproof or foolproof safe, whatever. All you need to, that holds some of your most precious stuff you have, and it contains your property. But all you need is a code to get into that. The safe doesn't need to know who you are. It's not important at all. That information doesn't matter. So I think, and maybe that's kind of what David's getting at too, is that identity it should be a voluntary matter, to where if you want to give that sort of information, go ahead and give it. Okay, but to take advantage of things that we can do now. Like a lot of technologies that have been developed and whatever. Identity shouldn't matter, and it's disconcerting because like we have the Real ID in the United States, which is launching in 2016 apparently, where you have to have a passport to fly. Now that's ridiculous. People are on its face. First off, people already people already pay their taxes to make all that the FAA and whatever else roll around in the first place. Do what it does. Okay, but now to have an extra requirement of requiring a passport to do that, and if you don't go get that, you can't fly. I mean, yeah, identity can be a very controlling matter, even when it's voluntary, because they tell you, well, okay, you don't have to get a passport, but then you can't fly. I mean, so technically that's voluntary, but that's terrible. That's controlling, and so I think the idea that it has to be attached to a specific person should be completely separate from an access control request.
So this is the notion that on the blockchain, for example, it doesn't actually track ownership, it tracks control. So whoever has control over your private key and makes the claim first on the blockchain will have the spending power of the coins in that address. And this is a confusion that a lot of people get into when they learn about Bitcoin, and even people I know that have been into Bitcoin for some time. They confuse control with ownership. Now what you have when you have a Bitcoin address, what you do is ideally you have control over the private key. Now, Greg brought up a really good point at the San Francisco meetup group, which I will link to down below in the description if it's not already there, where, Greg, you had this great quote where you said, real ownership comes with the potential of real loss. I'm quoting you there. That was a really, really powerful quote. It's one that I'm definitely going to be saying a lot more often to all the people I meet when I teach them about this thing, because there's a real downside, isn't there, to you having the private keys, because at the moment our identities on the internet are loaned to us. Like Twitter owns my identity on Twitter at Mr. Chris Ellis, and Facebook owns my identity on their platform, and really I'm only allowed to use it so long as they lend it to me. And so this notion that Brian brings up of access and control is a poignant one, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and I agree with almost I think with everything that Brian said. So it almost sounded as though he was rebutting some of my points, but I think in large part we're pretty much in complete agreement, and that a lot of these discussions, some part of the message is, I think, getting lost in translation, because these are somewhat nebulous concepts, and words are can be interpreted in various different ways. So the main thing I was saying was just that identity as a concept has use cases, legitimate use cases, and it can be very, very useful to do certain things. I completely agree with Brian that it should be voluntary. That I completely agree with everyone here that identity can be used to control people, and so lots of caution needs to be exercised with how these systems are implemented. And at the same time, we have to remember that no matter how they're implemented, a lot of the downsides often come from just bad legislation, from governments basically exercising the use of force through bad legislation. And there's not really much of a technological solution to that sometimes. Now, I think you asked me a different question, though, so could you repeat that?
Okay, so most of these, you've put in made some very good points. We don't own our online identities. Now, let me break this up a little bit, because this has been going on for years, right? This is one of my favorite thinkers in the whole space, in the debate, who isn't actually part of Bitcoin traditionally. It's Dana Boyd. She was a researcher. Last I checked, she was a researcher at Microsoft. I don't know if she's still there. And she wrote a very, very famous post called "Real Name Policies Are an Abuse of Power." And she was referring to Google Plus, just when that had come out, about their mandating that all new users use their real names. And this was the breakthrough that Facebook made in 2004, when it was the first online social network to start insisting that users use their real names. Now, we've said it many times before on this show, education is hard. It's a hard concept. And when you use the word voluntary, you have to be really, really careful by what you mean by that. The problem is you can say it's voluntary, and as Brian says, you can say you don't have to get a passport, it's voluntary, unless you want to fly, or unless you want to breathe, or unless you want to do anything. And the problem is that it's coercive, actually. And the problem, I think, that, Greg, people like you and me, and you're more technical than I am, but I sort of feel like I can bridge the gap on this show and in face-to-face at meetups with people, is that it's rather like getting into a car without having any understanding of basic Newtonian physics, right? You wouldn't expect someone to get behind the seat of a wheel and start driving around and using it if they didn't even understand the basic laws of motion. And I sort of feel like it's the case with the internet, where you've got one group of kind of tech entrepreneurs who know how the code works. The code, of course, is largely invisible. It certainly is if it's closed source, who then lease out, this was your point at the meetup in San Francisco, they lease out your identity and they give it to you on loan, but you don't really understand what's taking place here. The fact is, look, if I went on the internet and I had lots of people looking over my shoulder as I was browsing, what would you call that kind of behavior? You'd call it psychopathy, you'd call it stalkish, you'd call it weird, and you certainly wouldn't sit there continuing to browse the internet whilst people were looking at everything you were doing, except that is exactly what is happening. And just because you can't see it doesn't make it okay.
Yeah, okay, so thanks for recapping that. Yeah, let's go there. So at that meetup, yeah, I did make the point that most people's online identities today, they don't own it. Their online identities, what are they? Oftentimes when somebody asks what your online identity is, it's usually associated with your Twitter account, with your personal blog, maybe with your Facebook account, maybe even your email. But even email, most people don't own don't have control over their email. Their email is sort of leased to them for free or rented to them by Gmail. Pretty much virtually every single form of online identity today is not owned by those who have those identities, and that's a huge problem. The number one problem with that is censorship. If, for example, if suddenly Facebook starts deciding that they don't like what I'm saying about them, they can simply they can mess with they can close down my account, which if they do, the simplest thing to do. They can do something more nuanced, like they can prevent my posts from showing up in anybody's feeds, so I can rant and rave about them as much as I want, but nobody's going to hear me. With email providers, emails can get lost all of a sudden, and just in a black hole, etc. So there's this really big problem with the internet right now, and it has to do with identity. It has to do with this fact that people do not have control of their online identities. They either lease them, as in the case with domains. So anytime you have a personal website, you're renting that from ICANN, and ICANN can take that away from you. Or various governments can take that away from you. Either through a legitimate, so-called legitimate means, where the government steps in and says, okay, this domain has been seized by the United States government because they're doing things we don't like, or illegitimate means, where governments like Iraq and Syria and other governments can simply man-in-the-middle connections to that website and say basically, okay, you wanted Facebook.com, you have Syria Facebook.com now instead, basically, the secret police Facebook.com. Which Facebook almost is anyways, but our version of the secret police, Facebook.com. And there is a solution to these problems, and the solution is a double-edged sword, as you mentioned that quote, which is instead of having this lease or rent-based ownership of identity, we could have real ownership of identity, where you are in complete and total control of your online identity, and nobody can take it away from you without, breaking into your house, basically forcing you to divulge your private keys. And there's even solutions to that, like multi-sig, where if they try to coerce you, that doesn't get them much because they have to coerce 3-4 other people potentially, and you still, in other words, manage to retain ownership of your online identity. And once you have this, once you have strong ownership of identity, you can, you solve a lot of problems like man-in-the-middle attacks. But at the same time, yeah, real ownership comes with the possibility of real loss, where if somebody actually does manage to take your identity away from you, or be it your Bitcoin private key, they really do have your Bitcoins. They really do have your online identity at that point. And in the case of Bitcoin, there's not much recourse. In the case of identity, because it's such a fluid concept, you could, through your other social networks, reach out and tell people, oh, my identity was stolen. This is actually me, etc. In the case of Bitcoins, you're kind of a little bit
Greg,
more
do
on the
you
hook.
think that most average users, like my sister who knows nothing about tech, and every time we meet, I feel like I'm the local IT guy, like I'm the guy that my family actually go to for IT support on a whole range of issues, and like this isn't even on her radar. Like she doesn't even know this is a thing. And I feel like every time I go to a meetup of people that are new to this, it's either because they've watched something on the internet or a friend told them they needed to care about it, and they're just along for the free beer and pizza. But then they'll kind of listen. But you'll have their attention for all of 5 seconds. How do we communicate this issue in a way that is? I mean, you familiar with the Mailpile project, for example?
Yeah,
Like
they're
this
really
is
great guys.
right, and projects like this, one of the things, the pledges they made in their crowdfunding campaign was that we get user experience. We get this was a huge driving force behind that campaign. I noticed it too on your website. Like you've gone for a certain aesthetics, but how on earth do you get the average person to understand this stuff?
That's a really great question, and I think the answer is basically the same as it's always been. It's always the same answer. Even free beer and pizza at one point was a foreign concept to certain people. You had to explain to them what pizza was and why they might want to put that in their mouth and eat it, and convince them that they're going to be okay. And that's pretty much what we have to do with this topic. Is First, we have to work out all the technical details, and nobody needs to really know about it, as far as average people go, until we do that and make sure it's sound and secure. And then once we have all that figured out, or maybe simultaneously, we can, talk about it and figure out ways of talking about it that resonate with people. And how you do that depends on who you're talking to. Different communities understand things in different ways. They like, different kinds of language. Real ownership comes with the potential of real loss, resonated with you, but it might not with somebody else. The concept of leasing identities and renting identities might work with someone, might not with somebody else. This is just something that we need to talk about more and more, and people need to talk about it in different ways.
Great. Paige, you left us for a while. Are you okay? You back?
I am
We missed
okay.
you.
I don't. Yeah, thanks.
Google has
Yeah,
got
I
you.
have
They've tracked
problems
you
with
down.
Google Hangouts. Yeah, they don't like me talking about this stuff. I think it's yeah.
Well, look, I wanted to ask you because look, here you are. You're on Keybase.io. In fact, you invited me to Keybase.io, and it was part of what inspired me to do, the blockchain ID. And this is something that Paige I consider personally to be one of the best critics in this whole debate. She's asked me a lot of really hard questions. I like being asked hard questions, and so I'm particularly drawn to this. Was something that I put out a while back in November. I only really meant it as a light-hearted thing. I didn't invent anything new here. I called this the World Citizenship Project, and it was basically two things that already existed in the literature. On the one hand, you had something called a key signing party, and on the other hand, you had something called a blockchain. And all I did was put together a nicely worded README file, which gave you instructions for a voluntary identity system in a local community where you could meet up with a group of people. It tells you what you need. It's very, very simple. Like a weekend warrior, you could just go through this, set up your own meetup group in your own area, and it's like got a nice tutorial on how to pick a nice a good unguessable entropic password. And the idea was that this was voluntary. In fact, the word voluntary is mentioned 4 times in this piece. That didn't stop a lot of people kind of trolling me and saying like this is a a dangerous weapon for use of force. So Paige, I wanted to ask you like, well, why do you use Keybase then? Why do you use PGP? Why, as Greg sort of said, I think you may have left us, but he said, look, if we didn't have identities, none of us would be here today to talk about it because we wouldn't have been able to recognize one another.
So I use Keybase and PGP in order to communicate with individuals, or particularly PGP to communicate with individuals in an encrypted basis, and essentially to kind of verify that it's me. I honestly don't trust the hardware that I use enough that to know that it's 100% secure. However, I mean, in terms of identity, I use it, I guess, particularly as like a front-facing thing. However, there are some more general issues that come along with the identity concept in general. So I actually wanted to bring in another point that got me thinking this week. I read this article. It was a really long article about basically this one woman. She tweeted something that was really stupid, like kind of racist or something, and like it was just a really bad judgment on her part. And people do this all the time on Twitter. And then, you know, because of this global identity system that is Twitter, it turns into kind of like a mob effect where all these people are making assumptions about this one person based on this very small part of their personality that was probably just like not thought through very well when they were making it, and those situations, I think, are propagated through this concept of like a global ID system. So I'm not necessarily against ID systems, period. I think they're valuable in terms of small communities, and you know, when you're interacting with individuals, you know, in your area. When I'm interacting with, you know, the Bitcoin community in San Francisco, it's good to know, you know, who's reliable, who can help out with the organization, or you know, who's interesting to have speak. But in the end, I think the skilling effect is what introduces a lot of problems with the identities, particularly.
Because one of the great features of PGP, as you just said, is it allows you to keep your communications between your voluntary community private between you, and it also, to a large degree, gives you protection from masquerade, from anyone coming in and impersonating someone, although you know, you can have your private keys stolen and so on. Greg also mentioned the notion of multi-signature. So one of the themes that I think is coming up in an age of virtual, the word virtual, when we talk about the internet, doesn't mean it's not real. Actually, it's the word virtue means important, okay, or courage or something like this. Yes. So where we go online is based on what is important to us. That's what dictates our motion. You either go to something you really agree with, or you go find something you really disagree with and you start trolling people, right? And one of the sort of the interesting components that comes up with something like PGP is that because it's voluntary, and because it can be based between a self-select community based on what they find important, that geography just becomes situated on a much wider continuum. Geography simply isn't as important as it used to be. And what can happen now is that you can start to have relationships with people and start to get favors from people. We had people in the Feathercoin forum who, like one guy from Venezuela, who was getting financial support that he probably should have been getting from his government but wasn't. But because he self-identified with a group of people, was actually getting, you know, money for doing things like DJing and stuff like that live on air. He was actually getting an income from people he hadn't got before. Now, had he not had the ability to form an identity, had he not been able to have a trust account that he could use as a reference to everybody else, I don't think that would have been possible. So in some ways, I actually see these kinds of PGP, particularly as PGP as a protocol already has things like key revocation built in. So you can, I'd like to go to Greg next, because I want to hear you talk a little bit about OK Turtles. Also, I understand that you've got your own BlockchainID project. But one of the things that this technology promises is that we can have this hard discussion now that in many ways is framing the debate for a new civilization. We're actually talking about how should we live our lives, how should we conduct ourselves. And one of the things you can do is you can have things like plausible deniability. You can have hidden partitions on hard drives so that if somebody, you know, forces a gun to your head and tells you to reveal something, you know, they can't deny what it is that you've shown them. So, Greg, tell us a little bit about OK Turtles and whether or not this actually touches, and also the BlockchainID project I saw you'd set up as well.
Yeah. So OK Turtles is the word OK Turtles refers right now to two things: a foundation, so like an organization, and also to one of the projects that the foundation is working on, which is the OK Turtles browser extension. And the OK Turtles browser extension is just this idea that, yeah, if you scroll down to the bottom where it says Solutions, the OK Turtles browser extension is right there. Perfect. It's just this idea that people should be able to have secure communications online in an easy manner, in a manner that really does not, in any meaningful way, differentiate from how they currently have insecure communications online. And the blockchain and things like BlockchainID are just technical ways of making that happen, making that possible. That's what the OK Turtles browser extension is. It's right now it's a vision mostly, because the actual browser extension part isn't finished, and we're working on sort of on the underlying technology that makes software like that possible, called DNS chain. So that's where our focus is right now currently. And once DNS chain is implemented, it's very possible that we won't actually have to implement the browser extension. Somebody else could do it. Somebody else, for example, right now there's already a browser extension that does some of the things that the OK Turtles browser extension wants to do. It's called Mailvelope. But Mailvelope is, last I checked it, it was a usability nightmare for users, just like every single piece of GPG software is a usability nightmare. And you mentioned like key revocation in GPG. Key revocation is such an unusable thing in GPG that it shouldn't even be advertised as a feature, because if a feature is inaccessible to most people, then it's not really there. Using GPG to communicate with people is extraordinarily difficult, and it's extraordinarily difficult to also get it to be secure, because you have to make sure that you have the right key for the person. And right now, the way that you do that usually is, you have to go to a key server. Keybase is trying to make that a little bit simpler for people, but it could be even simpler. What we're shooting for is basically like a direct mapping from somebody's online identity to their key with a humanly readable name. Like, if Paige has her identity stored in Namecoin, then simply knowing her name should be sufficient to communicate securely with her. You could do things like the OK Turtle browser extension. Like one of the things that would be possible with it is to map Facebook identities to their correct public keys in a way that's man-in-the-middle proof. In other words, you don't have to trust Facebook to give you the correct public key. You can trust the blockchain to give it to you, which is very, very different from having to trust a potentially untrustworthy third party.
I just want to come in here, because one of the dangers with companies like Keybase and also OneName, and I've spoken to both of them, probably more OneName than Keybase, but at the moment, and without really telling anyone, they've actually been putting plain text, well, I know that OneName has been putting plain text data into the Namecoin blockchain. So I did not realize when I first signed up that my full name and all of the data I was putting in was going into Namecoin. The link wasn't made known to me, and it was only when I talked to Ryan on Twitter that he linked me to the blockchain. I was like, okay, you know what, I'm personally okay with this, because obviously I'm an early adopter and I like all this stuff, but had I not been an early adopter, I would have wanted to know that. And one of the key points that I think answers Paige's concerns quite well is that none of these blockchain ID-like systems preclude or stop you from using Tor or using MadeSafe, right? When none of us here on the side of trying to work out a new form of identity system wants the kind of tyranny and the control that we've seen governments show in the past, particularly in the 20th century, and coming out now with Facebook. So having a blockchain ID doesn't stop you loading up your Tor browser, and it doesn't stop you from using any of these other systems. But I do feel like when companies like OneName and Keybase start putting that data into the blockchain, I know Keybase has like its own kind of Merkle tree, but I mean, if I don't particularly think it's a good idea, or do you, Greg, to be putting in people's real names into blockchains which can't be removed later on?
Well, it's certainly not a good idea to mislead people. So this is I'd like to move the conversation away from kind of this. I think we're for some reason conflating various different concepts like usability. Like, for example, whether it's a good idea to put your full name into a blockchain has nothing to do with whether or not identity is good or bad. It's a separate question. Like, okay, so maybe one name needs to be more clear about what is actually happening with the information that people are putting, into their website. That's a usability concern, a usability issue. I'd like to move the conversation away from whether or not identity is, as a concept, good or bad, but rather, how is it useful, how it can be, and how can it be abused. Let's not try to label identity either, mostly good or mostly bad. That's I don't think that's a. I think that's like will lead us off topic, lead us astray. Let's just sort of focus on, okay, identity is a thing. We know that it has many potential good, uses. We know that it can be useful for achieving many different ends, and we know that it can be abused. So, let's talk about it from that kind of a perspective.
I have a point kind of going off of that and relating to, what Chris was saying about the ability to use anonymizing structures in tandem. I guess I kind of proposed what's the point of such a system, such an identity system, when we can use anonymizing systems. Like, what's keeping bad people from just doing all the bad stuff on the anonymous system and then doing the good stuff on the public system, attached ID? I think the ability to stay voluntary between leaving the system as a whole or just not using the system for certain things kind of breaks the system, right? If the point of identity is to kind of give you some kind of capabilities in terms of linking certain work you've done or ideas that you want to put out there, if it's just as simple to exit that system and put out other ideas that you don't want to attach your name in other ways, then I guess it just seems like it breaks down at that point.
Well, I think Greg's point for pushing this conversation into the utility of identity is a good one, right? So I think here context is important. If I just want to buy a coffee off of you, I probably don't need to know too much about you, because your ability to perform in that agreement is fairly spontaneous and immediately known to me. But if I'm going to be renting an apartment off of you, particularly if you're not going to be present throughout the duration, I probably would like to have more reputational data. And that's particularly true in the UK, where our housing market is an absolute state and there is no reputation system. And the only reason estate agents, and if you're an estate agent, I apologise, and come on and have your say on another show, but the reason why estate agents don't have reputation systems on tenants is because they wouldn't like it if the tenants had one on them. And that's why there's always been this kind of stalemate, because if you have absolute anonymity, then there's no responsibility and accountability. People can just run away from their actions. It's untethered. Brian, do you want to correct?
Yeah, I don't agree. I think that a lot of these digital implementations of identity in itself, really the first time it started was, unfortunately, I'm not the one to bring up Adolf Hitler, but was Diamog by IBM. Okay, and that's really one of the key ways that the Jews were able to get rounded up in Germany, was because there was this complete a census system, a centralized ID system. Okay, and as far as like accountability at a local level, look, nobody asks you. I live in a condo association. I live in a condo complex, and nobody ever comes up to me or Stephanie and says, "Hey, could we see your title, please?" No. I mean, it's not necessary at all. There's just, you've been here over such and so much time. People just kind of generally recognize that you don't have to. They just recognize that you're here and that you exist here. When you get to that level, there's no real need for any kind of stamp on a blockchain or stamp anywhere else to let people know that. The only time that's really needed, I think, is by people that want to know that are far away. But who cares about them? They don't live here. They have no
people
business.
run away from that. Like right now in the banking sector, if you want to run away from your crimes, it's quite easy because you can create shell companies, you can hire lawyers, you can hire lawyers to hire lawyers that can create shell companies and distance yourself from your actions. And one of the things I was going to start the show off on, but I was too dyslexic to get my tabs together on time, was, you know, the etymon, I brought this up before on the show, of where we actually get the word man from. The word man comes from anthropos, and it means the one who has a face, an eye and a face. And this is something down in below, like not this one, this one. This book, you know, by Robert Harrison at Stanford University brings up the notion of identity a lot in some of his work, Identity and Death, actually. And he says that one of the things that defines society writ large is the tethering effect that it has on our identity, our actions, and our place. It makes us addressable, and it gives us a stable reference so that we know where to find each other.
But I think, on it, Chris, where a lot of people want, where they voluntarily ask for these systems to come in, is that they need somebody to be held accountable. Okay, but the issue there is, I would also argue that civilization is based upon Blackstone's, whatever you want to call it, Blackstone's theorem or whatever. Better that 10 guilty people go free than one innocent person suffer. And I would much rather have 10 guilty people go free than have the blockchain be wrong. Okay, and so, you know, I mean, if that's what this all comes down to, is punishment, you know, or based upon accountability and whatever else, you know, so much of this technology is just trying to replace natural human intuition. And maybe the real issue, and actually Paige made this point earlier on Twitter, maybe some areas of human interaction cannot be transferred into some kind of digital space, cannot be transferred into a technology. And that's really important. You know, we might need to accept that not everything we do can get put onto a blockchain. In fact, I'd argue many things, you know, just because it gets put onto a blockchain, it doesn't suddenly become a good idea. Okay, so I think that the idea of anonymity, and it's not a new one. Epicurus talked about this. A lot of philosophers have talked about living anonymously long before there was Demirog or blockchains or Google or Facebook. Okay, but it's always been seen as a way of freedom. And people say, well, but then people can't get held accountable. Well, you know, then let's quote Ben Franklin and say it's better to have a dangerous liberty than to have a safe tyranny. And if we're talking about building a completely new system with all this stuff, like just like how Bitcoin showed, hey, you don't need banks, folks. You know, if we're talking about building a whole new system, then why not go all the way? Incremental. Even these big companies like Google and Facebook, they know, you can read in their papers at Google X and whatever else, it all says incrementalism doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. So you know, screw a lot of these incremental ideas. All right. And in fact, I'd even argue now. Just real quick, I mean, Greg's not one of these guys. I actually appreciate OK Turtles. I've talked about it on my show many times, you know, even though it's only been out a few months. But, you know, a lot of these companies, they're just going after making money. You know, some of these guys that you've had on, they know better. They know that this stuff is just making more efficient governments, but they don't want governments. They won't admit it, though. They won't tell you. You know, I mean, it is just about making a buck off of this whole thing. So anyway, that's my end point.
Well, you don't need to persuade me of that last point. Greg, do you have anything? I'd really like to hear what you have to say about some of that stuff.
Yeah, so this gets back to what I said earlier. So identity systems can be abused, and they can be also very extremely useful for doing all kinds of things. And the question, it seems, is, well, okay, are we really going to have this debate of, do we want to live in a world where everything is completely anonymous, and we don't have any kind of just screw all the identity systems because, you know, something bad can happen with them, and so we're going to live in a world that's completely anonymous because something bad can happen with it whenever you have identity. That seems to me like a non-argument, because something bad can happen in a world where everything is anonymous as well. You can make the exact same kinds of arguments. There's downsides to both worlds. In a world that's completely anonymous, you will not have accountability, and you're going to have a lot of people, you know, not caring at all, because there's no such concept as reputation at that point. So people can get away with anything they want, and we know that such a world is going to have a lot of downsides, and people are going to be unhappy with it for, you know, XYZ reasons. Just like we know that people are going to be unhappy with a world that has identity for XYZ reasons. So So let's discuss. Well, was the topic of this discussion, do we want to get rid of all the identity systems? Was that what we were supposed to be talking about? I didn't think that that's where we were going, but if that could be an interesting follow-up maybe to this, since it seems we're running out of time.
My concern is, though, that if you take Brian's point, if I understand you right, Brian, I'm always open to persuasion, you know that, but if your point is taken to its corollary, what you end up is creating a world where you're incentivizing someone, you're giving a market opportunity for someone to start persisting and consolidating large data graphs, right? So I just start installing cameras, taking notes off of people and saying, what did you see that person do? Because remember, and I said it before, the word predator comes from the word prediction. The predator's key skill is predicting its prey. And if I have more information than everyone else, then they don't have that information. Therefore, I'm valuable because I'm now able to tell the future. I'm able to say what that person's going to do next, just because I'm the only person that's been consolidating their face and their identity and their action.
Well, okay. I mean, one thing. Maybe I'm not getting you, but I mean, like you mentioned PGP earlier. PGP, I don't have a problem with PGP because all it does is attach. It doesn't have to be Brian Sovereign. I could say I'm Tommy the Green Ranger, and this is my PGP key. That's great. There's nothing else attached to that at all, and I think that that's fine and dandy. But I mean, let's be serious. A lot of this blockchain stuff, not Greg's thing, but some of these others, Ethereum, Factom, whatever, they want to attach to that digital identity that you make. They want to attach how much ether you have, your house, your car, all this stuff. That's where it becomes an issue. And Greg's point earlier, about the great loss and all that is certainly possible. But again, we have real world examples of that. So much of this bloat on life just is not needed. I've made it before that there's cars, you can own vehicles where you don't need a title for it. You don't need the stuff attached to anything. A bill of sale is good enough. And so what I'm saying is that there's things you can implement that are dumb and good enough that can get the job done that we're talking about having without having to have the centralized database of what we own and who we are. I think, and there's plenty of these examples out there, I think, if we look hard enough.
David's been sitting there for a while. Did you want to stick around, David? Did you have anything?
Yeah, that's just got a couple of points to make, really. I think, like all these conversations, and Greg's sort of hitting the nail on the head a little bit, one extreme and the other extreme are never correct. So it's not total anonymity. I don't think anybody's ever said complete anonymity is good, because unless you're wandering about as some strange alien being in our own planet, it wouldn't work. And the other point, though, I think that's not been clear is complete knowledge of everything about you is also wrong. So those are the two extremes. So the answer's in the middle, and this is what I was saying earlier on. Identity, when it's local, is valuable. It's good that I know your name and you know my name. We're speaking to each other. Maybe in 10 years we won't know each other's name because we'll have moved on, but there's no need to persist that information. I can't tell you all the people I was at primary school with and whatnot. So the local knowledge or the local ability to identify something's good and it's valid and it has to be. Even birds and stuff have different songs and they're speaking to each other. So, but the other way, and this is the way I always look at things when I'm looking at a problem, go 180 degrees. Imagine, take away, so we have a local identity, take away everything else. How could you run the world with no global persistent identity? So for instance, in the SAFE network, what happens when you go to a website, it creates a key pair and it allows you to log into it. And every time you go back, it's the same key. You don't need to log in. You're just automatically connected. So if you're Amazon or something, you'll know, oh, it's this key that came back. But you won't know that this key went and bought a washing machine in some other site. Is that not a much better situation? To be honest, you have multiple identities for your multiple different personas. Look,
yeah, sure. But this becomes very ephemeral. We have that with the cookie system already, where I go to a website, it puts a hash on my content folder, and then when I go back, it can remember me. But these are fairly disposable. But what happened on the internet was that the internet became this huge space for corporations and governments to come in.
They demand your name. They demand your global identity to log in. The demand of that global identity is Google, Amazon, the government, the DVLA for driving, the taxman, the demand for that global identity to tie these things together is what causes these problems. So you should be able to have your identity within your group, within your people that you speak to, and that can grow, and you lose it. It's a transient thing. That identity is the ability to communicate between humans, which is something that's very important. Identity beyond that is very debatable whether it's of any value at all. I mean, if you're saying about the houses, if there's some key that I've used to rent houses all my life, and then you could recognise that, you don't need to know it's David Irving, you don't need to know what college I went to, who my mum is, what her maiden name is, or any of this sort of thing. So the ability to get information is already there without tying it to this global identity. So I think what Greg's saying, I also agree with. We should never see keys. We should never see anything like that. That's all got to be user interfaced away, and that's extremely valid. So I think the problem that I have is a global persistent ID from birth to death. There's no requirement for that in a society, and just
I think when people
imagine it wasn't possible.
I suppose
it didn't happen.
When I used the term world citizenship, I didn't mean that the actual identity necessarily had to be global. I meant the protocol was global.
So but it was, at the moment the problem is your identity is global.
True. That's true. I think Greg wants to come in.
Yeah. Yeah. So when we say global identity, it can mean different things to different people, and people can interpret it in different ways. There is one interpretation that I just heard from David, which is having a global identity, and with it attached and associated a lot of baggage about your personal life. And that certainly can be very problematic. But there are complete, like, we're working on a global identity system, and it's not associated with any of that information. We don't want it to be. It's basically like you voluntarily choose what information you want to put there, all the user interfaces for this need to be very clear. That this is going to be public information. That what you put here will be known by everybody in the world. So be very careful. And you yourself get to select what kind of identity you put out there. You can have a global identity that's completely anonymous. You can come up with a completely fictional character, a fictional pseudonym, a different name, and it can still be a global identity. It's a very different kind of system from, say, a government-based, social security number identity system where they tie, everything about your entire life with you that you take, as you said, from birth to death. So the word global identity can mean very different things. Some of those things can have very big downsides, and some of the meanings of it can have almost no downsides and lots of upsides. Like, for example, right now we're having the world, it's a fact, and we are no longer having just local conversations. This conversation right now is being held by participants who live in multiple different time zones, in different countries. We're getting along really great, having a great time, good conversation. It's being viewed by, who knows how many people on the internet via YouTube. I think that's great. And we're, none of us are right now advertising what our, mortgage is, or who we're, necessarily married to, or any other personal information that we don't want to. But these are global identities that we're actually building right now. Like right now, by having these conversations, by putting our faces and our names onto the internet, it's already naturally becoming a global identity. And where the blockchain comes in very handy is when you want to talk to me securely without having the state monitor what you're actually saying. The blockchain is essential to that, because it's the best system that we know of. There's no better system for getting my public key to you without a man in the middle than the blockchain that I know of. So, yeah.
I think it's the same. What we're saying is the same thing there, Greg. But what I'm saying is that what you're talking about, having this global identity, which you're Greg and I'm David, and people, however many people see this, will notice that. But when you're doing different things, you should be able to just spawn identities all over the place and keep them. So when you go to Facebook, go as XYZ or whatever. Facebook's maybe different. You're trying to be public, but if you're going to Amazon or you're going to these other sites, you don't. it shouldn't really be very easy, if at all possible, for all of that to be tied together, because one of the security things which is amazing is, I remember AOL, for instance, anonymized a whole bunch of IP addresses and put them out a few years ago, and within a few hours someone from MIT phoned some old grandmother in New Hampshire or something and told her everything about herself. So the ability to spider information back to a central ID, or however that ID is created, is really, really powerful. Any good graph database or whatever will be able to do that. So when you need a key to get in somewhere, it would be pretty valuable, I think, and very good to be able to say, well, this is my global identity, I'm David. I'm going to go to this shoe shop. I'll just spawn an identity for that. And if I want to build a reputation with that shoe shop, I'll keep using that spawned ID, but it won't be attached to me at all through the blockchain or anyway. So,
well, this in which case it doesn't sound like we're disagreeing at all then, David, because this is exactly the use case that I put forward when I was suggesting the blockchain ID. The reason I wanted to
as long as it doesn't tie to the blockchain, though.
Right. So yeah, I'm not suggesting we put plain text into the blockchain, of course, but I'm giving some forward capability of verifying an event in time, because else how are we able to reference? Yes, of course it will. But what will be in a blockchain is a one-way hash function, not something that can be tethered by a company building a rainbow list.
Yeah, well, if they could build a rainbow list quite easily, if you're using that in multiple places, that's not a difficult.
Well, yes, but then it's up to me. But then what we're saying is the responsibility is pushed back into the moment of decision for me. That when I choose to give up one of these identities, this penumbra, many identities that I walk around with, what we've got to teach people is that this is a one way. That in the old days, you used to be able to put things up on the internet and you could delete them, and if you were lucky, you'd get away with it. But now we're in a world where the persistence is distributed, and if persistence is distributed, if memory is distributed, you have no control over what someone else does with that data on their local hard drive.
No, I think what I'm saying though is, if you create an ID that ties back to block XYZ, you can't spawn IDs and then prove them using block XYZ. You have to use a different block for every ID. So if you spawn an ID off a particular hash on the blockchain, and you keep spawning IDs off this sort of thing, they'll always tie back to that. So you have to have a way of having an ID that you want. So you want to have Chris Ellis, a Twitter type ID. So you get that to block, it doesn't matter. But you want to be able to create multiple other IDs that you can persist in an anonymous fashion. Anonymous to every other service apart from the one that you're logging into with. And you could have an ID for, I don't know, paying your rent, another one for another one. But as long as they're very separate and there's no tie whatsoever to them, and that becomes quite difficult because you have to be careful of your IP that you're using. And if you're using blockchain stuff, it's unencrypted all the way to the blockchain. You have to remember that stuff. The ability to graph some of this information is ferociously good. And what you could find out about somebody using the blockchain, for instance, particularly because it is unencrypted and the issues with Tor and the blockchain are way overlooked in this world just now. So the care and diligence that you would have to take is quite a lot. You'd have to be able to get to some different machines and spawn IDs from different IPs using some kind of VPN or something, or else just use MadeSafe, of course. But
it's not ready yet, David. This is the thing. I would love to use MadeSafe, but it's not here.
If you're a really good programmer, but these are the kind of issues that we're looking at the whole time. It's the hidden lack of security. Because if you just say encryption or Tor or something, there's a hidden lack of security. But in terms of identity, I think what I'm trying to get across is you have different identities for all your different things that you do in life. I mean, you can speak to a child molester who's really good at history, talking about history. So if you want to know history, you could speak to him there and say he's a 10 out of 10 for history, but he's a 0 out of 10 in terms of a human.
So one sec. So I know you have made this point. I think everyone understands what you're saying, but that's very interesting. claim that you just made about the child molester, that in some ways we need to build tools that save us from ourselves, right? Because if all I'm doing is I'm on the internet and I'm trying to learn about history, it shouldn't really matter to me what this person's past is, depending, especially if it's a long time ago, because we all change as we grow older. And so one of the things that we don't want is a world that never forgets and never, importantly, forgives. I brought up this distinction as well on the show with Paul Snow, is that in a world where memory persists for so long, where we can't forget, forgiveness becomes all the more important.
Only people who you have to forgive, though, that's the thing.
Well, then this becomes a behavioural issue, and it's back to Dana Boyd's point about it's not so much the ID system that's the problem; it's the enforcement issue. It's the fact that you're building social norms where now it's normal to put your real name into a social networking website, and if people have gone through a Western-style education where they're indoctrinated and they're told off whenever they do, they're taught how to be taught. They're not taught how to learn. They're not taught how to question authority. Then they grow up as adults, and every time a company tells them to do something, they do it because that's what they've always done.
Yeah, the companies are requesting things which, at the moment, look as though they're meaningless, and it's not that. But I'll log into Google, will tell them stuff, and the cost of privacy is beyond the normal kind of human way of thinking. But the fact that it is so easy for these people to do it is because of these global, an ID that represents everything about you, and I think that's what we're saying. We're moving from a natural world to a digital world. You shouldn't replicate in the digital world what you do in the natural world. Turn it up, and that's what I'm saying. The design here is, imagine there is no identity that ties all aspects of your life to you, and design your systems around that. So design your login where you don't take information, you take a hash or whatever, and work that way, and force companies to go down that route, so that there's no ability for Google to
you're giving control. You're basically taking the same technology that existing companies use on the internet, and you're giving that back to the individual.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to sort of bring things to a close. Before I sort of wrap things up, because I'm planning on doing a show on this every month from now on, and I really want Ryan as well from One Name and the Open Name Foundation to come on. But Greg, I had actually a final question to you, because I want to know about this Facebook plugin. I said last year, I don't know, I was shouting this out at Meetup, could somebody please build an extension that lets me encrypt my status updates on Facebook so that only certain people could read my status updates, but not Facebook? Please tell me that you're working on this, because it sounded, I was looking through your website. Is there a way I could send encrypted messages on Facebook and break their business model from the inside?
Yeah, you can do that right now. You can, say you have a friend on Facebook and know their PGP key, and encrypt a message to them and copy paste the ciphertext into the message box and send it to them, and do that all manually. What we're working on is making that simple, and to truly make that simple, you have to kind of change the internet. And that's what we're working on with DNS Chain. We're working on this low-level software that changes how some of the fundamental protocols of the internet work, like DNS and HTTPS. They're not secure. HTTPS is more secure than DNS. DNS is a complete wreck. But HTTPS is also not sufficiently secure, and it's not sufficiently usable for this purpose. And we also want to remove Facebook, because you can have a HTTPS connection to Facebook, but what if you don't trust Facebook? You need like a separate connection to something that you do trust, a connection to the blockchain, where you can simply say, hey, I want to talk to Chris. What's Chris's public key right now? Right now at this moment. I don't care about any of his past public keys. I don't care about any revoked public keys. I want to know what his current public key is. With the blockchain, it's nice in that you don't need to even revoke a public key. It has no reason for a concept revocation. You don't need to check a revocation list. You just say, what is Chris's latest public key? And all this can be automated, so that when the extension goes and it sees, okay, so this person is on Chris's page, it's got the extension installed, he's trying to send a message, he's clicked the little turtle or the lock icon. Let me automatically fetch his public key and encrypt the message. And I'm not even going to show any ciphertext because that's scary to people. And I'm just going to, send that over. So that's just, technically challenging, and we're working on
So
it.
the opportunity here is that we could make the whole business model could fail for these large companies, because they rely at the moment on taking your personal identifiable information and then selling that to marketers. And I often do hang around at the accelerators and the incubators, and all the VCs turn up for the board meetings, and these young entrepreneurs, very naive entrepreneurs in their 20s, usually university leavers, who are about to set up some 2.0 product or 3.0, whatever number their marketing company has decided it's on now. And they always laugh about it. They laugh about it because laughing is the only way they can cope with the depravity of what they're about to do. But they're about to engage in an enterprise. It's mostly a marketing drive. There's usually one developer, 3 marketers. And then the job is to put a nice, shiny, juicy wrapper on a database, entice you in with the lure of something for free, and then once you're in, lock you in, and then market your data onto companies. And it's got to the point now where they don't even lie to each other about it. They just say what it is. I'm going to market the data because users don't pay. Everything's free. It's the freemium model.
Right. So if you just have encrypted messaging over Facebook, that's not gonna sync Facebook. They're still going to be chugging along, making their billions of dollars, because there are so many. First of all, only a small fraction of users are actually going to know about this extension. Of those people, only a small fraction are going to actually install the extension, and only a small fraction of those who install the extension are going to use the extension. And only a small fraction of those who use the extension are going to have friends who use the extension. So what's needed, and that's one problem. Then a second problem is well, there's all these other widgets on Facebook, like what kind of movies do you like, what kind of games do you like, all these like buttons, and you can't really encrypt a like, because if you encrypt it, it's not going to, your Facebook will not function if you encrypt that. Those are messages you are sending to Facebook. So I mean, even if you encrypt them, Facebook has to be able to read them for a like to function. So if you want to cripple Facebook, what you need to do is make something remake Facebook, but remake it in a completely decentralized way. And you can do that. You can do that with the blockchain. You can do that with things like Ethereum. You can do that even not necessarily with Ethereum, but you need a blockchain essentially, because the blockchain is what decentralizes. The blockchain is what actually puts the control back in people's hands and away from anyone else. Only the blockchain can do that, to my knowledge, in a way that's usable. Other systems can do that, but it's not as usable.
This sounds like Diaspora, which a couple of years ago promised to allow self-hosted social networking. So you could host your own social network, and what was open and global was the protocol itself. And then you would just run a patch. But the reason it failed is because, guess what? People don't know how to set up a VPS. They don't know how to SSH into their VPS, and they don't know how to set up FTP and get everything set up. So a lot of this is going to be about the marketers and the developers talking well to each other. If I had any final point to this show, having been through this amazing discussion today with you all, is that we need less fragmentation and more collaboration, because I don't think a lot of us really disagree on a lot of these points. I think we do, but I do think at the moment that there isn't enough kind of working together. After all, the internet was built on requests for comments, RFCs. It was built on a small group of people who allowed to create this virtual world where existence could emerge without a stable spatial referent. And we could all enjoy pictures of kittens and lolcats and whatever else on the internet in this kind of weird sort of global simultaneity. So, guys, do you want to come back in a couple of weeks or maybe a month? Let's give it a month to kind of sit on it, because I'm going to be very busy soon as well with a crowdfunding campaign. And what say we get the guys from One Name as well on here, because I understand that these guys have just released a proposal for a distributed hash table, which, David, didn't sound too dissimilar to some of the ideas I've heard coming out of MadeSafe. And there's no reason why this stuff couldn't be run on top of MadeSafe, which doesn't use a blockchain at all, no?
Yeah, that's true. I believe that the blockchain is something that's part of the evolutionary phase that we go through. So will MadeSafe be as well. Things will just change and get better. So I'm not a hugger of the blockchain, and I'm not a hugger of DHTs either. I just think that they're tools that we've got just now.
Tools, yeah. Exactly. They are just tools and ways for us to cope. I'm also going to recommend this book, which I read a number of years ago. I'm not being paid to make any of these recommendations. I'll always tell you if I am. But there is a link in the description below. This is a really, really cool book that was written by the guys that used to work at Yahoo and also built Flickr, which was actually, in my opinion, Flickr was one of the best social networks ever. Mainly because I measure the quality of a social network by its ability to cross-pollinate and to take people from different groups and different areas in a kind of almost sort of what do I call it, kind of happy simultaneity or happy surprises, pleasant surprises where like I didn't know I was going to like this thing or this person or this topic, but now you've shown it to me, it kind of makes sense. So these kind of weird serendipitous encounters. So yeah, listen, thanks everyone. Please keep your donations coming. You've been really, really grateful. I'd really like to thank Sovereign Monkey as well for buying me about 30 days worth of Soylent. So I'm going to be eating GMO for the next 30 days. I know Brian's kind of laughing at me, but I tried it out today actually. It's pretty good. It's got like whey powder and like flaxseed and like all your nutrients for a day. I don't have to cook again, and it's like $2 per meal, like, well, not even actually, less than that, like $1.50 per meal. So it's very, very, very cheap. So thank you very much. And also all the beta testers that have been beta testing my new app, which runs in Chrome. Thank you to everyone. You've been really, really super helpful. We plan on getting the crowdfund launched probably in the next 7 days, hopefully. I'm very, very careful about how I make commitments, as you know. So listen, thanks everyone for joining us. That's been really, really good discussion. Have you all enjoyed yourselves?
Yeah, thank you so much for hosting it.
Yeah, no, this is really
fantastic.
You know, we said like Tom, you know, Tom's away at the moment. He's got a job in San Francisco. I've got a job now as well, but we still want to keep going with this. And Tom, you know, when I started this, we said that the one thing we wanted this channel to do is, you know, say something that would piss someone off. That was the agreement. Like, we didn't want it to turn into like a marketing thing or something where people just come on to promote their products. We like to keep these topics relevant because our duty of care is to you, the audience. So I hope that you've enjoyed it. We really appreciate hearing from you. Please have your say in the comments below. You can also tweet us at WorldCryptoNet on Twitter and me at Mr. Chris Ellis. Until next time, I'll see you all later. Bye-bye.